If I'd stopped the tape right there, maybe it wouldn't have followed me into real life. The screen was dim, colors drained like the life had been sucked out of them. SpongeBob was there, centered perfectly, but he wasn't moving. No silly laugh, no over-the-top antics. He just stared forward at me. His eyes were wider than they should have been, the pupils pinpricks glassy and wet, as if they had been filmed under a different light than the rest of the cartoon. At first, I thought it was a glitch, some corrupted VHS artifact. But then the sound changed. Not the kind of distortion you expect when magnetic tape degrades. No static, no mechanical whirring. It was whispering. Soft, low voices layered on top of one another, almost too faint to make out. And I swear, none of it sounded like it belonged in a children's show. Words twisted together. My name. Fragments of sentences. Things I couldn't fully catch but felt. I leaned closer, even though everything in me screamed not to. SpongeBob blinked. Once. Slowly. Deliberately. The tape shouldn't have been able to do that. It was looping, I realized, playing the same short section again and again. But each time his expression changed, almost imperceptibly. The corners of his mouth drooped lower. His pupils followed me across the room. And when I reached for the stop button, the voices rose all at once, as if they knew. If I'd had any sense, I would have pulled the plug, smashed the tape, burned it. Instead, I froze, trapped by the impossible feeling that the cartoon wasn't just playing. It was watching. I should probably explain how I ended up with the tape in the first place. Before all of this, my life was normal. Or at least as normal as it gets when your biggest thrill is digging through flea markets and online auctions for retro cartoon merch. Everyone's got their thing. Some people obsess over records, some chase old comic books. Me? I hunted for lost episodes, rough cuts, anything that felt like a piece of animation history. That's how I found it. I was scrolling through a late-night auction, half asleep when I spotted a listing with no photo, just a vague title. Unreleased SpongeBob tape, rare. Normally, I'd skip it. Too many scams, too many sellers trying to pass off burned DVDs with Sharpie labels. But something in me wanted to click. And when I did, there it was. A grainy picture of a plain black VHS, the kind you'd record home movies on. No case, no studio markings, just a strip of white label across the front scrawled in jagged handwriting. Final cut, do not distribute. Collectors live for moments like that. Studios test animations all the time. Copies leak. Rough drafts slip through the cracks. This could have been gold. A storyboard version, an unaired short, maybe even a banned skit that never made it past Nickelodeon's censors. I convinced myself it was worth the risk. Still, the handwriting bothered me. It wasn't neat or professional, the kind of labeling you'd expect in a studio archive. It looked rushed, uneven, almost frantic, like whoever wrote it was shaking, like they didn't want anyone opening the tape, but they had to mark it anyway. I told myself it just added to the authenticity, that it made the story better. A true collector's dream, so I bought it. I didn't even hesitate, and when it finally arrived, dusty, heavier than it should have been, I ignored the knot in my stomach. I slid it into the VCR, grabbed the remote, and told myself I was about to witness lost history. That's when things started to change. At first, I laughed. I expected some weirdness. It was an unreleased tape after all. But when the opening theme started, I thought maybe it really was just some rough cut. The bubbles floated up. The whistle blew. The pineapple house rose from the sea. Except the audio was off. Not broken, just wrong. The theme was slower, a half step lower, like someone had dragged a finger against the reel. I told myself it was a duplication error. But then I noticed there was no laugh track. No bursts of silly energy, no musical cues filling the silence. Every motion was sluggish, like the characters were wading through molasses. SpongeBob's usual flurry of movements, popping up from bed, brushing his teeth, frying patties, dragged on too long. The silences between actions stretched uncomfortably, forcing me to sit there and wait, breath held, for the next sound. And when SpongeBob finally turned to face the screen, I felt my stomach twist. You'll think I'm exaggerating, but his eyes, they weren't animated. They weren't flat, drawn shapes with black dots. They looked filmed, glossy, wet, too real against the flatness of his yellow sponge body, like someone had spliced in actual human eyes, blinking once in a while, following movement across the room. My cat, who usually curls up beside me during late-night viewings, froze in the doorway. His fur puffed up, back arched, tail low. He made this low, guttural sound I'd never heard before, then bolted out of the room as if chased. I laughed nervously, trying to convince myself it was just a coincidence. But the silence he left behind only made the distorted cartoon feel heavier. There was no energy, no joy, no wacky pacing. It was SpongeBob, but drained, empty, and somewhere deep in my chest, I realized this wasn't just some rare rough cut. It was something else, and it only got worse from there. The episode didn't follow any storyline I recognized. No boating school, no Krusty Krab antics, no slapstick chaos. SpongeBob just wandered. He shuffled through bikini-bottom streets, but the backgrounds looked wrong. At first, I thought it was unfinished artwork. Grainier textures, flat colors like someone had photocopied concept sketches. But the longer I looked, the more I realized the scenery wasn't just simple. It was degraded. Buildings warped at odd angles, shadows stretched too far, like the whole town was being eaten away frame by frame, and it was empty. No fish walking around, no jellyfish, no bustle. Just silence. SpongeBob's shoes scraped slowly against the ground, each step echoing faintly. I found myself leaning forward, waiting for something, anything, to break the stillness. That's when SpongeBob stopped in the middle of the street and turned directly toward the camera. "Why are you watching?" The voice was wrong. It was SpongeBob's actor, sure, but slowed. Hollow, almost resentful. My throat tightened. For a second, I actually glanced behind me, stupidly convinced he might be talking to me instead of Squidward or Patrick. But there was no one else there. The screen warped with static, cutting to brief flashes, Patrick on a rock, his mouth hanging open, eyes too wide, unblinking. Squidward standing by his house, pupils pinpricks. A faint trembling at the edges of his frame, like the film reel couldn't hold him steady. Neither spoke. Neither moved. They just stared, directly at the viewer, before vanishing again into static. I tried to laugh it off. Maybe it was a storyboard experiment. A psychological gag that never aired. But my skin crawled with every flicker. Because this didn't feel like a test. It felt deliberate, personal, and then my TV screen flickered to black and a sentence appeared in plain white text. "This wasn't made for you." My pulse hammered in my ears. I almost hit eject. Almost. But some sick part of me needed to know what came next, so I didn't stop. The longer I watched, the less it felt like a cartoon. The silence gave way to something else. At first, it was just faint distortion under the usual background hum, but soon it layered, low whispers threading through the speakers, words too garbled to make out. Then came the screams. They weren't cartoon screams, not slapstick yelps or goofy sound effects. These were raw, human, ragged cries that rose and fell like people begging for help somewhere far away. The audio stuttered, overlapping itself until it felt like dozens of voices were pressing against my skull. And then, over it all, SpongeBob started to laugh. Not his usual squeaky, high-pitched giggle. No. This laugh was wet, guttural, heavy with breath, too human. Each chuckle cracked and dragged like someone exhaling through waterlogged lungs. It filled the room in a way that didn't feel like it was coming from my TV. I scrambled for the remote, my hands slick with sweat. The images on screen began glitching violently, frames splicing into things that had no business being there. A dimly lit street at night. Blurred faces caught mid-motion, eyes white from the camera flash. A wall covered in something I couldn't identify but looked far too real for animation. My chest seized with panic. I jabbed the pause button, but the laughter didn't stop. It echoed from the speakers, looping, deepening, as though pausing the tape had only trapped it in my living room. I yanked the VHS halfway out of the deck, my heart in my throat, but the sound continued. Wet, dragging chuckles that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I should have thrown the tape out right then. Smashed it, but instead, I slid it back in. Because no matter how much it terrified me, some part of me needed to know what I'd just seen. Needed proof, so I pressed play again. I told myself I was going to prove it. That if I rewatched frame by frame, I'd catch the trick. The editing glitch, the prank, the explanation that would make it all make sense. But the second viewing only made things worse. Every time I slowed the tape, something new appeared. Hidden frames I hadn't noticed before. Shadows flickering inside SpongeBob's pineapple house. Shapes stretching across the walls that didn't belong in the animation cells. Sometimes the camera itself seemed to tremble, like it wasn't a cartoon at all but footage filmed by hand. the perspective subtly swaying as if someone were holding it. And then there were the subliminal cuts. A frame of a door, a frame of a stairwell I didn't recognize, a frame of eyes, real eyes, bloodshot, staring directly through the screen. They lasted only a fraction of a second, but once I saw them, I couldn't unsee them. I leaned closer, sick with fascination, and that's when SpongeBob spoke again. Not to Patrick, not to Squidward. To me, I see you. The voice wasn't booming or distorted this time. It was low, intimate, like someone leaning in too close to your ear. My skin went cold. I froze with my finger hovering over the pause button. The whispers underneath the audio grew louder, tumbling over each other in a language I didn't understand, and that's when I realized this wasn't just a lost episode, it was unfinished. Because it was never meant to end. I needed answers. I wasn't the first. That's what chilled me the most. I spent hours scouring forums, digging into dusty old threads buried beneath layers of forgotten internet. What I found were scattered fragments, half-baked creepypastas, rants from collectors, panicked comments that ended with silence when the user never posted again. They all circled the same idea: lost episodes. Not just SpongeBob, other shows too. Rugrats, Ed, Edd and Eddy, even obscure pilots no one remembered airing. Every account described the same pattern: distorted tapes that slipped into circulation, footage that didn't match studio archives, characters who looked straight at the viewer. One post claimed these episodes weren't mistakes at all but tests, cartoons that remembered who had watched them. Another swore they had a tape where a character repeated their username, something impossible to fake in the VHS era. The replies were filled with skepticism, sure, but also fear. Stories of collectors who vanished after bragging about their finds, accounts that went dark overnight, and buried deep in one forum in a thread from 2007, I found a single comment that froze me in place. The user wrote, "You'll think it's just showing you something forbidden, but that's not all it does. The tape doesn't just show you things. It takes notes." That line burned itself into my brain. Suddenly, every glance SpongeBob had thrown at the camera, every whispered word layered under the track, it wasn't just random horror dressing. It was targeted, deliberate. The thought clawed its way in and refused to leave. Maybe the tape wasn't showing me what was on it. Maybe it was showing me what it had learned from me. I woke in the middle of the night to the sound of my TV. Static hissed through the room, then warped into SpongeBob's voice, low, dragging, distorted. But these weren't scenes I'd watched. He was moving differently now, slower, head tilting in unnatural angles, his gaze fixed not at the camera but outward, toward me. Then came the knock. A dull, hollow tapping from inside the glass 3 times as if he was testing the barrier between us. My breath caught as faint watery shadows rippled across the floor, seeping out from the screen, slithering toward my bed like ink in water. And that's when I realized the worst part. The tape wasn't even in the VCR. I couldn't take it anymore. The whispers, the shadows, the way my cat refused to enter the room. It all pointed back to the tape. I grabbed it off the shelf, the plastic slick in my hands. Not dusty, not dry. Damp. Like it had been dredged up from the bottom of the ocean. I lit a match and held it to the corner. The flame sputtered, hissed, then died as if the tape itself exhaled against it. My skin went cold. From the TV, static pulsed and SpongeBob's voice, no longer high-pitched and cheerful, slid through the air. "If you stop watching, I'll watch you." The screen flickered, his face pressing closer, outlines warping as if the glass was thinning. I stumbled backward, clutching the VHS. His eyes bulged, unblinking, salt water dripping from the edges of the frame. In a panic, I hurled the tape at the screen. The impact shattered both with a deafening crack. For a split second, I swear liquid, briny, heavy, spilled across my floor. Then everything went black. When I woke, shards of glass were scattered across the floor. The TV was a husk, the tape a ruin of cracked plastic. For a moment, I thought it was finished. The room felt lighter, almost safe. But then when I caught my reflection in the blank window, I froze. I blinked once, twice, and the reflection didn't follow. It lagged like it was waiting, watching. At night, I still hear it, a muffled chuckle, the same wet human laugh I first heard through the static. My cat hasn't stepped foot into the living room since that night. She hisses if I even carry her near the doorway. I tell myself it's just trauma, a trick of nerves and memory. But every time I power on a screen, my phone, my laptop, anything, I feel the air thicken. Like something on the other side is pressing close, waiting for me to slip. I can't turn on a screen now without dreading who's looking back. You think this ends with me. But it doesn't. That's the real curse. This thing doesn't live on tape anymore. It spreads by memory, by story, by the simple act of listening, and now you've listened. Don't dismiss it as paranoia. Pay attention tonight. If your phone glitches, if your screen flickers, if your pet refuses to sit near the TV, don't ignore it. They notice before we do. So tell me, have you ever seen something in a cartoon that shouldn't have been there? A frame you couldn't explain? A laugh track that sounded just a little too real? Share it. I need to know I'm not the only one. But if your TV flickers tonight, don't check it. Because if he notices you, it's already too late.